Welcome again. So we'll be starting off with one of the services, and in this case we are just to have one particular service, which will be employee service, and this is going to just be used to demonstrate the employee service. I'm just going to have that as the description. I'm going to use Java 17. Then with regard to the dependencies, I'm going to add a couple of dependencies. So the first dependency is going to be the Spring Dev Tools. Then the other one is going to be Lombok. Then the other one that I'm going to have to alert me in terms of the configurations is going to be the Spring Configuration Processor. And then the fourth particular one, we are going to make use of RESTful endpoints, and in this case I'm going to make use of Spring Web. And then in addition to this, we are going to make use of a database, and I'll be using data JPA. So I'm going just to search for JPA, and this one I'm going to have a data JPA, and then from there I'm going to also have the connected to the database, and in this case I'm going to make use of a simple MySQL. All right. So given all these dependencies that we have, then what you just need to do is to generate the project, and click generate, and you'll be able to have a download of the same. So for this case, I'm going to show you how you can be able to generate the same project using VS Code, given that mostly you can work within VS Code to generate this particular project. So to get started on VS Code, just press Ctrl+Shift+P, and then search for Spring Initializer. And then for this case, we are going to select Create Maven Project. And then from here, it will be able to look up for the different versions of Spring Boot that are available, and we'll be able to have an option of selecting the particular Spring Boot version. Alright, so we are going to select the current version of Spring Boot, which is 3.25. I'm going to select that. I'm going to make use of Java as my language. Then from there, I'm going to give this one as io.github.ing.john as my group ID, and then from there I'm going to give this one as employee service-service. Then I'm going to select the packaging to be jar file, and then from there I'm going to specify Java 17. Then from here we are in just to search Lombok, select that, and then we are in to make use of DevTools. The second one, we are going to make use of JPA, so you can select that Spring Data JPA. And we are going to make use of MySQL. We are going to also have the configuration processor. Configuration processor. So this one is going to be the Spring Configuration Processor. And then for this particular one, we also want to make use of Actuator, so that we can be able to expose the health metrics of our service. And all this we're going to make use of 1, 2, 3. Then we need also the Spring Web. So we need the Spring Web dependency to have our application. So at that we'll be able to have this particular 7 dependencies. And just to confirm from our previous this one, you can see that we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dependencies. But then here, because of the introduction of Actuator, you can also introduce it on the Spring Initializer project, browser based. So I'm going to select that 7 dependencies, and then with this I'm going to click enter. Then it will be able to ask me to the project folder to where I'm going to store the project, and I'm going to store it to the Spring Demos project. So click that as generate this folder. Alright, so once the project is created, you can actually unzip it from the browser downloaded file, and then you can open it within VS Code. So the next thing that we're going to do here is going to ensure that we are able to run our project. So usually whenever I'm working with this particular project, I usually have my version 1 specified. So I'm going to start with version 1.0.0 as my first version whenever I'm working with this particular project. So With the introduction of JPA here, and MySQL, we need to ensure that we have a ready database connection to this particular effect. So we are going to also create a particular database that will be able to assist us or allow us to connect to the various connections that are available. So to do that, we are going to quickly start up our MySQL database and get the particular connection to that particular database for this particular case. So to quickly do that, we are going to make use of Docker compose YAML file to create our database, and then also we'll be able to proceed and configure our database within this particular application. Alright, so to do that, we are going to ideally have another file which will be able to give us the creation of this. So I'm going just to quickly give you that particular file. So in this case, we are going to call that one as docker-compose.yaml file. So we are going to specify this particular file, and in this case, we need now to configure the MySQL that you're going to run for this particular case. So quickly, I'm going to get the configuration, and I just explain all through for this particular case. So let me quickly obtain that. All right, so okay, so for MySQL, we're going to start with the services tag here for Docker, and then for that, we're going to specify the particular service, and in this case, I'm just going to copy this, then bring it here. So we are going to have the services file, then we need MySQL, and then we need to make use of the latest image, and then we need to call this particular container MySQL. Then we are going to have the default root password being this one, and the database I'm going to have the default one as generic. But then for this case, we are going to have a simple database which is going to be employee service. So I'm going just to have employee database being created by default. I'm going to make use of MySQL users root, and then my password is going to be generic. And then for this case, we need also the section for volumes, whereby we are going to create the volumes for this particular data, so MySQL data, so that whenever the container is restarted, we still have our data. So to get the volumes declarations, so I'm going just also to walk you through that. So you need to have another section here, which is going to be volumes. So volumes, and then within here we are going to specify this particular volumes, and with that we'll be done with the first volume. And then the next thing that we need to do is to configure this particular scripts. This way we are going to put our database scripts, and we can be able to have them copy to the container path of /user/db script. So in this case, we need just to create another folder here, whereby we can be able to have db scripts, and that will be able to store some of the files that we need to have within the container whenever we are going to initialize that. So that is all that you need, and then once you're done, you can be able to run docker compose up, and then within this particular location, and then it will be able to generate for you a database. Now once we have the database, so I'm going just to use an already database with me here. So I'm going to make use of my database, and in this case we're going to have docker exec. So let me try to maximize this for you to see clearly. exec-it MySQL, and then I'm going to have bash. Alright, so with this I'll be able to connect to my current Docker file for the MySQL, and then with this I'm going to make use of MySQL-u root, and then my password is going to be that. So I'm going to give my password as generic. Then you can see here I can have show databases. And then with this, you can be able to see that I have already other databases. So for this case, I'm going to create a new database, which is going to be create database employee. Then I have my database, so the next thing that we need to do is just to configure our database within the application. So just to zoom this one out a little bit so that you can be able to see clearly. I think that font is enough. Now with this, we are in now to create our configuration for connecting to the database, and within my resources file, Java main resources file, and then the application properties, I'm going to rename this particular file to YAML file. So I'm going just to change the extension to be a YAML file. Then this is the one I'm going to use within this particular application. So in this case, I need to also convert to the Spring, then application, and to application, then and to name is going to be this one. So that is my application name. The next thing that we need to configure is going to be the database connection. So how then do we specify the database connection? So we need to specify the data source. So we are going to have data source. Then the data source is going to have the URL to the database, and in this case we are making use of MySQL, so we are going to do JDBC, and then within this we are going to specify the drivers MySQL, and then colon, and then // Now here we need to think of how we are going to specify the host of MySQL. Ideally MySQL whenever we be dealing with Kubernetes. So in this case, we are just to make use of a variable here, and this one is going to be MySQL underscore host, and then this is the variable that we'll be referring within our Docker environment, and then within this, the default will be localhost. All right, localhost. Localhost. And then that is going to be the host, and then followed by that we are going to have a port, and then in this case we are going to just have another variable which is going to be MySQL underscore port. So we're going to make use of underscore port. Then the default port will be 3306. Then followed by that we are going to specify the database name. So our database name also is going to be configurable. So in this case, we are going to make use of MySQL employee database name, employee database DB name. So we are going to have that name, and the default name for our database is going to be employee. So in this case, we are going to ensure that it's configurable in a way that you can be able to specify a different host from the environment variables, a different port from the environment variables, and a default database name from the environment variable. So once this connection detail URL is ready, then we need to specify the username. So the username for this case, I'm going to use the default. We're going to make it employee, and in this case we're going to say MySQL DB username. So we just to have that, and then the default is going to be root, and the same thing for the password. So you're going to make use of password, and in this case you're going just to have that as MySQL DB password. All right, so the default one, I'm going to go with my generic password that way. So that is all that you need to configure our data source. And now, given all this, the next thing that we need to do is to expose our management health ports for this particular application. So we are going to specify that using the management endpoint, endpoints. So we're going to specify the endpoints, and then we're going to expose a few endpoints for this, and in this case we're going to make use of web, and then we're going to expose this one, exposure, to be equal to. So the exposure, we are going to include every endpoint, so include. So we'll be able to include all the endpoints within the actuator provided by the actuator endpoint. And in this case, that is how we are going to have that particular endpoints exposed because of this particular actuator dependency that we actually specified down here. So let me pick that. So the actuator dependency will be able to provide us the mechanism of obtaining more information from our application. So that is set, and let me see what we haven't configured, and that's all. For now, we can try and confirm that our application is actually running. So what you're going to do is to start up our application and ensure that it's actually running. So we just click run. Alright, so as you can see, our application is actually running, and you can be able to see that it was able to connect to the database. There is no error indicated, and then you can be able to see that we have 13 endpoints exposed within Actuator, and we can actually confirm these particular endpoints by opening our browser and proceeding to localhost 8080/actuator. And you can be able to see that these are the endpoints that we have. So we can be able to see the actuator endpoint, we can be able to see the different bins that are exposed, the info, and mostly the one that we use on Kubernetes to check the health status of our application is going to be this one. So if I open this one on a new tab, you'll be able to see that our current status of our application is actually up. So that is the one. And then in case we want info, we can make use of info and be able to see that at the moment we don't have any other info details for this particular application, but then that is given by default by Actuator, and you can be able to see also even the metrics for the same application. So you can just confirm that, and you can be able to see the different metrics of this particular application that are available for you to use within the metrics endpoint. Alright, so that is it in regards to starting our application and configuring it. So the next session we are into start creating our entities and the REST endpoints.